Hello everybody and welcome to a brand new season of the Jacksonville Symphony and our first insight of the year. Today we're going to keep things quite simple with a celebratory champagne cocktail.
And I thought a classic champagne cocktail would be a great way to start since we have a program full of classics. So this is about as simple as anything that I think we've ever made. We're just going to begin with 2 flutes. We're going to drop a sugar cube in each one. I would probably suggest white sugar rather than like a turbinado sugar because it's a little bit less sweet. And then on top of those, we will put a few dashes of bitters. Now we can choose either lavender or orange. What would you?
Do lavender, please.
Lavender. So for Courtney, do about 10 drops lavender bitters. And for moi, do about the same in orange. Then sparkling wine or champagne. Today we're going to use Gruet, which is North Mexican sparkling wine. I'm told, this is third hand, that New Mexico has soil most similar in the world to the Champagne region in France. And it's done in a traditional method, so it's a lot of bang for the buck. Definitely recommend a Brut. Nothing on the sweeter end to go, since we're using sugar in our nice Symphony flutes.
Lesson ronde.
That's right. And then just a lemon twist to finish. Here we are.
Very nice, thank you very much. Here's to the new season.
New season. Cheers. That'll do.
Very refreshing.
Yeah. So glad to have all of you here with us this week as we're kicking off the new season. And we're doing it with 2 household names, Mozart and Beethoven. And the Mozart is the first of a season-long series of 5 piano concertos to celebrate our new Steinway Concert Grand. So first, tell us a little bit about how excited you are. I assume quite excited to have this new instrument. And also about, let's begin with the Mozart. Talk a little bit about this piece, context of Mozart's life, and what makes this one unique.
So Tony and I and our CEO had a very exciting weekend trip to New York this summer. We went to visit the Steinway showroom and factory, which is in Astoria in Queens, actually in a part of Astoria that's named Steinway because they built so many houses for their factory workers there at the turn of the 20th century. And we went to choose a brand new 9-foot concert grand Steinway D. And we were given a tour of the factory. We saw how all the pianos were made. And then we were shown into a showroom with 5 pianos side by side. And we were joined by Natasha Peremsky, a wonderful pianist who was with us 2 seasons ago and will be with us next season as well. And she played all the pianos for us, and then gradually we all began to gravitate towards one, and we chose that piano, which then arrived here a few weeks ago.
And they're all unique because all Steinways are handmade as opposed to on an assembly line. So each one has a very distinct character and voice and tone and everything.
One of the things that was really impressive in the factory was just the level of craftsmanship. I mean, it's just astonishing. Decades worth of gradual improvements, each patented, as the action and the build of the piano all became refined. Totally fascinating. So we chose this one piano. It arrived a couple of weeks ago. It's been sitting on stage, acclimatizing to Florida humidity, and we will hear it performed for the very first time this weekend on Friday and Saturday. We welcome a wonderful pianist, Daniel Shu. He's going to play Mozart's 20th piano concerto, K466 in D minor. One of Mozart's most characterful and famous piano concertos. Written in 1785, Mozart was at the height of his fame in Vienna. And he performed this really as a vehicle for his own compositional and virtuosic pianism. He played the first concert himself. It's unusual in that it's in a minor key. It's in D minor, which is a very famous key for Mozart. This is one of the first really famous pieces that he wrote in D minor. Later, he would write Don Giovanni a couple of years later. And D minor in that represents the devil, the demonic side of Don Giovanni, and the hell into which he's sucked at the end of the opera.
And the first movement, I think, is really evocative of some
Very
of that
much,
music.
Very much. The first movement opens with syncopated chords and a kind of rising tonics dominant bass line that sounds very much like the introduction to Don Giovanni. And then, of course, at the very end of his life, the Requiem would also be focused on D minor. So it's a particularly characteristic key for Mozart. The first movement is very stormy. We had this phrase in German, Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, which was a particular atmosphere in the classical period, and that's very much what Mozart is evoking here. So that meant that in the Romantic era, after Mozart's death, when much of his music went out of fashion because it was seen as too happy and too trivial, this piece remained in the repertoire, and it was a piece that Schumann and Brahms and many other famous composers included in their concert programs, so it never really left the repertoire.
I think one thing that's interesting, the third movement has a journey quality to it of dark to light. And that's something that we see, a tool we see utilized a lot in the Romantic era in the 19th century. Yeah. And I don't think anyone would claim that this concerto falls within the Romantic style, but I think that in and of itself is very different than a lot of the pieces that Mozart or Haydn would have written, in that it has a narrative, almost a quasi-narrative or an arc that is sort of a journey, which is very 19th century in a way.
Although I think it's slightly different from that, because I think he just writes the happy ending because classical audiences expected a happy ending.
Maybe.
I think, and particularly the way that it's done. So the finale starts off with very much the atmosphere of the first movement, and then at the end it just kind of changes into D major and ends with this happy little ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum tune that sounds like a character from one of the operas saying farewell. I think it was just a convention at the time that they didn't like sad endings and tragedies, for example, like Don Giovanni.
Right.
Even though he gets sucked into the pits of fiery hell, we still have to have all the characters come out.
The Greek chorus at the
out
end.
Out of the convention of the opera and say, oh, don't worry, only bad things happen to bad people, you'll all be fine, dear audience.
Right.
It's a wonderful finale. There's also, of course, the second movement, the romance in between the first and last movements, which is a very simple song-like melody that the piano begins and then is taken up by the orchestra and expanded very beautifully. All these movements are vehicles to show off the very delicate and virtuosic pianism of Mozart. And as we were choosing a piano in New York, I was particularly conscious of finding an instrument that would be very clear in the treble, because so much one of the things that we did was just played high notes to see how long they would sustain. So it's going to be really exciting. And of course, this piano is still very much in flux. It'll be voiced by a technician from New York coming this week. So we haven't really heard what it sounds like in Jacobi yet, so it's going to be really exciting.
And it will evolve as it gets played and sort of broken in, so to speak, in the coming months. But it is a stunning instrument, and we're very lucky and grateful for the opportunity to have this. So, following that, we move into Beethoven's First Symphony, which was only written about, he began it probably about 12 or 13 years later, but premiered about 15 years after the Mozart. So, what do we hear that is hearkening to the masters of the generation before Mozart and Haydn, and what's characteristically Beethovenian?
So 1792, Beethoven's 22, and he goes to Vienna to study with Haydn, who he had admired and worshipped all his life. But he has a kind of complicated relationship with Haydn. He meets Mozart, but then Mozart dies. Mozart's safely dead, no competition from a dead man. Beethoven is such a powerful genius that he feels competitive with Haydn, even as he's being taught by him. And he only studies with him for a year, and then the relationship kind of goes south. In those years between 1792 and 1800, Beethoven writes a lot of music, all centered around the piano. He writes 2 piano concertos, about a dozen piano sonatas, lots of chamber music which includes the piano, but not a symphony. And perhaps this is because he was so intimidated by Haydn, who's the father, the king of the symphony, who'd written so many. But eventually, in 1799, he sits down and begins to write the symphony. And it's premiered in 1800 on one of these huge concerts that nowadays we just wouldn't be able to tolerate, with movements from the Creation by Haydn, a Haydn symphony, Beethoven piano concerto, and finally his first symphony. It sounds immediately different though from a Haydn symphony. One of the first things that we notice is that he uses the winds a lot more than Haydn ever did. He also begins in a way that scandalized audiences at the time, but that we hardly even notice nowadays because our ears are so accustomed to modern music. It begins in the wrong key. So we hear the woodwinds strings pluck a chord, and the woodwinds play a forte piano on the dominant of the subdominant. So totally wrong key.
But it's obvious that isn't even the key. We're not even sure what key we're in.
No.
It's not even fooling us yet.
Right, because why would a symphony begin on a dominant seventh? That implies it's going somewhere else. Usually a symphony says, ta-da, here we are. So it's immediately set up to confuse us. The winds take us into very strange keys, and it's not until a few bars later that we finally arrive in C major.
Which, after the slow introduction, is actually over a minute of music, during which we think he leads us to believe, we have finally arrived in this key, but then that turns out to be the dominant of G major. So
that's right.
He fools the listener more than once along that way until we land in the fast allegro.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of a little bit more standard classical.
Yes. So when we think about what differentiates a symphony from, let's say, a piano sonata, one of the things is that the themes tend to be a little bit more simple in terms of their grammar. So Beethoven begins the allegro, the main fast part of this first movement, with something that's very simple. Dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da, ba, 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 bum. And that's because it was public music, and it was supposed to be able to appeal to a broad range of people in a public space. So the themes tend to be slightly more obvious in this early Beethoven symphony. What is totally different from Haydn, though, is that there are sforzandos, accents, notes that are louder than others, all over the place. And that's very characteristic of Beethoven, this kind of almost fist-thumping kind of emphasis that carries through the music all the time. What I think is much more interesting is what happens in the later movements, and this is what really shows Beethoven as an individual. First of all, the second movement, which is an andante, is really a minuet. Ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum.
Which traditionally would have been the third movement.
The third movement, so that's weird.
In the generation before.
Yeah, and it's also got this weird offbeat accent, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, sort of limping minuet. Then the minuet is actually a scherzo. So even though Beethoven calls it minuet, he doesn't call anything scherzo until the second symphony. It's one in a bar, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, which is a totally new...
Definitely not minuet.
No, that's a totally new Beethovenian thing, which would characterize all his symphonies. And again, it's full of these heavy accents that throw you off balance and make you question where the first beat of the bar is.
Yeah.
And then the finale begins with this very funny comedic opening, a big G, unison G, and then this kind of wimpy, meandering scale theme in the first violins that keeps stopping and keeps getting suddenly softer. Sort of like a big, what's going on? And then the allegro, which is really fast, a rondo, begins with this sparkling, fast theme based on that same scale that began, but now much faster. And again, this is a movement that's full of surprises, much more like Haydn in certain ways. You can imagine Haydn having written this finale, one that surprises you, that throws you off balance all the time, but that's winking at you and smiling all the time.
Right, which we don't get for much longer in Beethoven.
No.
I mean, this is about to be non-existent in his music.
Yeah. I mean, the second symphony, a little bit comedic, but then in the third symphony, there's so much more weight and so much more semantic questioning that has to be solved.
Right.
So this is as classical as Beethoven gets, but already it's got big kind of inky thumbprints of Beethoven all over it.
Yeah. So it's a very classic capital C program, but full of, I think, a lot of innovative elements for both of these composers. and really hope you can join us this weekend to hear this and celebrate us being back for another season.
With no distancing on stage.
With no distancing on stage.
And some of us without masks, Winds and Brass and me, will not be masked during the concert, but you all will, unfortunately, still, and so will the strings. But that's what we have to do to play music together, and we're so happy to be back. Really looking forward to sharing this program with you and introducing the new piano.
Yeah, so please join us Friday or Saturday evening in Jacoby Symphony Hall. Go get your tickets at jacksymphony.org. We'll see you on Friday, Maestro.
Friday.
Cheers.